Chapter 46. 500 seconds later, his heart was still beating. Mr. Pendanski screamed. The lizard, which had been in the cereal box, was springing toward him. Mr. Sir shot in midair. Stanley felt the blast shatter the air around him. The lizard scurried frantically around his very still body. He did not flinch. The lizard ran across his closed mouth. He glanced at Zero. Zero's eyes met his. Somehow, they were both still alive, at least for one more second, one more heartbeat. Mr. Sir lit a cigarette. I thought you quit, said one of the other counselors. Yeah, well, sometimes sunflower seeds just won't cut it. He took a long drag on his cigarette. I'm going to have nightmares the rest of my life. Maybe we should just shoot them, suggested Mr. Pendanski. Who? Said the counselors. The lizards or the kids? Mr. Pendanski laughed grimly. The kids are going to die anyway. He laughed again. At least we got plenty of graves to choose from. We've got time, said the warden. I've waited this long. I can wait for another few. Her voice trailed off. Stanley felt the lizard crawl in and out of his pocket. We're going to keep the story simple, said the warden. The woman is going to ask a lot of questions. The AG will most likely initiate an investigation. So this is what happened. Stanley tried to run away in the night, fell into a hole, and the lizard got him. That's it. We're not even going to give them Zero's body. As far as anybody knows, Zero doesn't exist. Like Mom said, you got plenty of graves to choose from. Why would he run away if he knew he was getting released today? Asked Mr. Pendanski. Who knows? He's crazy. That's why we wouldn't release him today. He was delirious, and we had to keep watch over him so he wouldn't hurt anybody or anybody else. She's not going to like it, said Mr. Pendanski. She's not going to like anything we tell her, said the warden. She stared at Zero and the suitcase. Why aren't you dead yet? She asked. Stanley only half listened and to the talk of the counselors. He didn't know what that woman or what AG meant. He didn't even realize that they were the initials. It sounded like one word, AG. His mind was focused on tiny claws that moved up and down his skin and through his hair. He tried to think about other things. He didn't want to die with the images of Warden, Mr. Sir, the lizards etched in his brain. Instead, he tried to see his mother's face. His brain took him back in a time when he was little, all bundled up in a snowsuit. He and his mother were walking hand in hand, mitten in mitten. They would both slip on some ice and fell and rolled in some snow-covered hillside. They ended up at the bottom of the hill. He remembered he almost cried, but instead he laughed. His mother laughed too. He could feel the same light-hearted feeling he felt then, dizzy from rolling down the hill. He felt the sharp coldness of the snow against his ear. He could see flecks of snow on his mother's bright and cheery face. This was where he wanted to be when he died. Hey, caveman, guess what? Said Mr. Sir. You're innocent after all. I thought you'd like to know that. Your lawyer came to get you yesterday. Too bad you weren't here. The words meant nothing to Stanley, who was still in the snow. He and his mother climbed back up the hill and rolled down again, this time on purpose. Later that day, they had hot chocolate with lots of melted marshmallows. It's getting close to 4:30, said Mr. Pendanski. They'll be waking up. The warden told the counselors to return to the tents. She told them to give the campers breakfast and make sure they didn't talk to anyone. As long as they did as they were told, they would have to dig holes anymore. If they talked, they would be severely punished. How should we say How should they? They will be punished, one of the counselors asked. Let them use their imaginations, said the warden. Stanley watched the counselor return to his tent, leaving only Warden and Mr. Sir behind. He knew the warden didn't care whether the campers dug any more holes or not. She found what she was looking for. He glanced at Zero. A lizard was perched on his shoulder. Zero remained perfectly still except for his right hand, which slowly formed a fist. Then he raised his thumb, giving Stanley the thumbs up sign. Stanley thought back to what Mr. Sid had said earlier, about the bits of conversations he'd overheard. He tried to make sense out of it. Mr. Sir had said something about a lawyer, but Stanley knew his parents couldn't afford a lawyer. His legs were sore from remaining rigid for so long. Standing still was more strenuous than walking. He slowly allowed himself to lean against the side of the hole. Lizards didn't seem to mind. Chapter 27. The sun was up and Stanley's heart was still beating. There were 8 lizards in the hole with him. Each one had exactly 11 yellow spots. Warden had dark circles in her eyes from lack of sleep. Lines across her forehead and face that seemed exaggerated in the stark morning light. Her skin looked blotchy. Satan? Said Zero. Stanley looked at him, unsure if Zero had spoken or he just imagined it. Why don't you go see if you can take the suitcase from Zero? The warden suggested. Yeah, right, said Mr. Sir. Lizards obviously aren't hungry, said the warden. Then go get the suitcase, said Mr. Sir. They waited. Satan Lee, said Zero. Sometime later, Stanley saw a tarantula crawl across the dirt, not too far from his hole. He had never seen a tarantula before, but there was no doubt what it was. He was momentarily fascinated by its big hairy body moving slowly and steadily across. Look, a tarantula, said Mr. Sir, still also fascinated. I've never seen one before, said the warden, except in. Stanley suddenly felt a sharp sting on the backside of his neck. The lizard hadn't bitten him, however. It was merely pushing off. It leapt off Stanley's neck and pounced on the tarantula. The last Stanley saw of it, one hairy leg sticking out of the lizard's mouth. Not hungry, huh? Said Mr. Sir. Stanley tried to return into the snow, but it was harder to get there when the sun was up. As the sun rose, the lizards moved lower in their hole, keeping mainly in the shade. There was no longer on his head, and his shoulders had moved down to his stomach, legs, and feet. They couldn't see any lizards on Zero, but believed there were 2 between Zero's knees, shaded from the sun by the suitcase. How are you doing? Stanley asked quietly. He didn't whisper, but his voice was dry and raspy. My legs are numb, said Zero. I'm going to try and climb out of the hole, Stanley said. As he tried to pull himself up, just using just his arms, he felt a claw digging into his ankle. He gently eased himself back down. Is your last name your first name backwards? Zero said. Stanley stared at him in amazement. He'd been working on it all night. He heard the sound of approaching cars. Mr. Sir and the warden heard it as well. You think it's them? Asked the warden. It ain't the Girl Scout selling cookies, said Mr. Sir. He heard cars coming to a stop and the doors open and shut. A little while later, he saw Mr. Pendanski and 2 strangers coming across the lake. One of the tall men was a business suit and a cowboy hat. The other was a short woman holding a briefcase. The woman had taken three steps for every 2 taken by the man. Stanley Yellens, she called, moving out ahead of the others. "I suggest you don't come any closer," said Mr. Sir. "You can't stop me," she snapped. Then take a second glance at him, wearing pajamas, pants, and nothing else. We'll get you out of here, Stanley," she said. "Don't you worry." She appeared to be Hispanic, with straight black hair and dark eyes. She spoke a little bit of a Mexican accent, trilling her R's. "What's in the tarnation?" Tall man exclaimed as he came up behind her. She turned on him. "I'm telling you right now, if any harm comes of him, we will be filing charges not only against Mrs. Walker and Camp Green Lake, but the entire state of Texas as well. Child abuse, false imprisonment, torture."